This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today though, we're doing something a little bit different, as I'll be giving you my picks for the top 10 fixed Magic cards that are still busted. By fixed, what I mean is the card was intentionally designed as a powered-down version of an earlier card that was incredibly powerful. For many of the cards in this list, the cards that they are trying to fix are from Alpha, Magic's very first set, and a set well known for having lots of busted cards. An example of this are the variety of fixed lightning bolts. The two most notable examples are probably Chain Lightning and Shock. Lightning Bolt is of course an instant that costs 1 red to do 3 damage to any target. Chain Lightning is a sorcery instead and gives your opponent the opportunity to copy it, and Shock only does 2 damage. These are examples of fixed Lightning Bolts, and these cards have still gone on to see a ton of play in a variety of formats, showing you just how strong Lightning Bolt is. And this is the kind of thing we're going to look at in this video. When they design a fixed card, they're trying to address their earlier mistakes while still creating a card with a similar design. But the cards in this list are all still incredibly powerful and have seen a massive amount of play, and in most cases, they also got banned or restricted like their predecessors did. Alright, let's dive in with my picks for the top 10 fixed cards that are still busted. At number 10, I've got Path to Exile, which is a fixed Swords to Plowshares. Swords to Plowshares is a card from Alpha that is arguably Magic's best single-target removal spell. For 1 white mana, it exiles a creature, and its controller gains life equal to that creature's power. The downside isn't near enough to balance Swords to Plowshares, though. As a result, it's one of the most heavily played removal spells in all of Magic history. Path to Exile was printed 16 years later in Conflux, and it has the same basic effect and cost as Path. It's a 1 white mana instant that exiles a creature, but it comes with a different downside. Instead of giving your opponent life, they get to search up a basic land and put it into play tapped. This is definitely a bigger downside than giving your opponent some life, at least in most situations, as ramping and fixing your opponent's mana is no small thing, and I mean you even end up 2-for-1ing yourself when you cast Path. But it turns out, even that downside isn't enough to keep it from being one of the most heavily played removal spells in every format it's legal in. In fact, in some decks, Path to Exile is better than Swords to Plowshares, because many of the decks that have used Path over the years run cards like Aven Mindcensor and Leonin Arbiter, which can take away Path's downside entirely. Most of the cards on this list have been banned in some formats, but that isn't quite true of Swords to Plowshares, which is only banned in Historic, and Path to Exile, which has never actually been banned anywhere. That's why I have these two down at the number 10 slot. Still, it's inarguable that either of these aren't incredibly powerful Magic cards. Powered down Swords to Plowshares is still incredibly good. At number 9, I've got Wasteland, which is a fixed Strip Mine. Both of these are lands that can tap for colorless, or they can give themselves up to destroy a land. Strip Mine, printed in 1994's Antiquities, can destroy any land, while Wasteland, printed in 1997's Tempest, can only destroy non-basic lands. One kind of funny thing about Strip Mine is that Wizards of the Coast intentionally designed it so that people who didn't have powerful dual lands or Library of Alexandria from Magic's earlier sets could level the playing field. Suffice it to say, it worked pretty darn well, as paying 0 mana to destroy an opposing land is a completely insane effect. Things can get especially silly if you recur it. As a result of all that power, Strip Mine ultimately got banned in Standard, Legacy, and Extended, and restricted in Vintage, and it remains restricted in Vintage even today. Wasteland was Wizards of the Coast's attempt, 3 years later, to have a card occupy the same role in all of those formats that Strip Mine got banned in. Making it so it could only destroy non-basics definitely powered it down, but players could still deal with the kinds of lands that Strip Mine was supposed to deal with. Despite being significantly weaker than that all-powerful Strip Mine, Wasteland quickly became a staple in every single format it was legal in. These days, it's one of the most heavily played cards in both Legacy and Vintage. For what it's worth, I do think they've figured out over the years how to print lands that disrupt opposing mana bases that aren't too good, with cards like Tectonic Edge and Field of Ruin both seeing a ton of play because they're so good at disrupting mana bases, but neither of them are so good that they can make things impossible for any deck reliant on non-basic lands. At number 8, it's Exploration, which is a fixed Fast Bond. Fast Bond is an alpha enchantment that costs a single green, and it lets you play any number of lands on each of your turns. In other words, on turn 1, you can make a stupid amount of mana right out of the gate by putting all the lands in your hand on the table. There is a downside here. You take 1 damage anytime you play a land that isn't your first land in your turn, but we all know that losing a bit of life is well worth ramping your mana to the moon on turn 1. Fast Bond ended up getting banned in Legacy and Extended and restricted in Vintage. It is legal as a full 4 of in Vintage today though, and as you'd expect, it sees significant play there. Exploration was designed as a powered down version of Fast Bond. It's also a 1 green mana enchantment, but it only lets you play a single additional land each turn. This still gives you some impressive ramp, but it doesn't allow for an utterly ridiculous start to the game the way Fast Bond can. Exploration sees a ton of play in Legacy lands, where it can be especially insane with sacrifice lands, like the aforementioned Wasteland and Life from the Loam, which can allow you to get back your Wasteland and play it twice in a single turn. In other words, even a powered down Fast Bond is powerful enough to power an entire deck archetype in Legacy. At number 7, it's Yogmoths Bargain, which is a fixed Necropotence. Necropotence is from 1995's Ice Age, and it's an enchantment that costs 3 black mana. It makes you skip your draw step, and if you discard a card, you exile that card. You can also pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library face down, and you put that card into your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Obviously enough, this means Necropotence can draw you a ton of cards for a very cheap mana cost, and if you can combine it with life gain, as many decks have done over the years, it isn't hard to draw your whole deck and win the game with a combo. You could also put it into play as early as turn 1 with Dark Ritual. All that power has led to Necropotence being banned everywhere but Vintage, where it's restricted. Wizards of the Coast took another crack at a black enchantment that draws you a bunch of cards for life a few years later in 1999's Urza's Destiny, and they designed Yogmoths Bargain, which costs twice the mana, because surely that would be enough to balance Necropotence, right? Well, maybe it could have, except they made the card's effect significantly more powerful. You do still skip your draw step, but when you pay life to draw cards with Yogmoths Bargain, you get them immediately. That's a significantly more powerful text box, even if the card does cost significantly more mana. Upon being printed, people almost instantly found a way to break it, generally by cheating it into play on turn 1 or 2 by casting Flash and putting Academy Rector into play, and letting it die to tutor up the bargain and put it on the battlefield. Like the card it was supposed to be a fixed version of, Yogmoths Bargain ended up getting banned everywhere but Vintage, although Yogmoths Bargain is legal as a full 4 of in Vintage, unlike Necropotence. At number 6, I've got Underworld Breach, which is a fixed Yawgmoth's Will. While it isn't in the same color as Yawg Will, their overall effect is very similar. The original Yawgmoth's Will was printed in 1999's Urza's Saga. It's a sorcery that costs 2 generic and a black, and it lets you play lands and cast spells from your graveyard for the rest of the turn. If cards would be put in your graveyard from anywhere that turn, they get exiled instead. This enables combo decks to go wild, especially if they're casting ritual effects that net them mana. It isn't unusual for someone to cast their entire graveyard after casting Yawgmoth's Will, and obviously that delivers insane value. Urza's Saga is famous for introducing several cards that resulted in utterly busted combo decks, ushering in a period known as Combo Winter, and Yawgmoth's Will was a big part of that. To get things under control, it ended up getting banned everywhere except Vintage, where it was restricted, and today many Vintage decks do run the single copy of Yawgmoth's Will they are allowed. Underworld Breach was printed much later, in 2020's Theros Beyond Death. It's 1 generic into red for an enchantment, and it has almost the same effect as Yawg Will. It lets you cast spells from your graveyard for a turn. Breach does it by giving them Escape, which means you have to exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast them. Obviously, you can't go quite as crazy with this as you can with Yawgmoth's Will, which can potentially allow you to cast everything in your graveyard. This is because Breach makes you use up your graveyard for fuel to cast things from your graveyard. It's also an enchantment, which means your opponent can potentially remove it before you can really go off. Additionally, the fact that they made this red also seems to be an attempt to make it worse, as red isn't exactly adept at using its graveyard, at least not on the same level as black. However, even with all those guardrails added to Yawgmoth's Will, Underworld Breach ended up being an utterly broken card too. Like Yawgmoth's Will before it, it enabled combo decks in multiple formats. While the setup was a little more challenging, there were enough ways to mill a bunch of your deck and cast a ton of spells from your graveyard. It ended up getting banned in both Pioneer and Legacy because it was far too easy to abuse in both formats. At number 5, I've got Time Spiral, which is supposed to be a fixed Time Twister. Time Twister is part of the Power 9 cards from Alpha that are incredibly powerful. For 2 generic and a blue, Time Twister makes both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library, and then they draw 7 cards. While it's symmetrical, any card that draws you this many cards is gonna be pretty good. While the Twister is definitely the weakest card in the Power 9, it was clear even in the game's earliest days that the card was a problem. Along with the other cards of the Power 9, it was restricted in the very first banned and restricted list in the history of the game, and it remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage today. A few years later, in 1998's Urza's Saga, Wizards of the Coast tried to create a fixed version of Time Twister, and the way they went about this was similar to how they tried to fix Necropotence later. They started by making it cost double the mana of the original card, but rather than just leave it at that, they made the effect of the card way more powerful. Time Spiral has the same basic effect. Both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their deck and draw 7 new cards, but you also get to untap 6 lands. So, while it costs double the mana up front, in the end, it's basically free. And because you untapped all of your lands, you're going to get the first crack at playing all the new cards you draw. Time Spiral gets especially silly if you untap lands that make multiple mana after casting something like High Tide, because in that case, you actually net mana while ripping through your entire deck. Time Spiral has enabled combos in many formats over the years, because its ability to rip through your library and make sure you still have mana available is pretty much unrivaled. Ultimately, Time Spiral, like Time Twister, had to get banned everywhere but Vintage, where it was restricted. At number 4, it is Vampiric Tutor, which is supposed to be a fixed Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor is the original tutor, and the card that established the word tutor to mean search your library for a card. For 1 generic and a black, it lets you search up any card and put it directly into your hand. While not technically considered part of the Power 9, Demonic Tutor got restricted alongside them in Magic's very first banned and restricted list, so it was clear that they made this card a bit too good. For one thing, you could use it to search up other cards in the Power 9, which would kind of defeat the purpose of restricting them in the first place, so if they had allowed people to play 4 Demonic Tutors, restricting cards wouldn't matter nearly as much. It was also a great way to search up combo pieces, as tutors always are. 3 years later, in 1996's Visions, Wizards of the Coast took another crack at designing a black tutor that had no restrictions, and they came up with Vampiric Tutor. It costs half the mana, and it's an instant. Those are 2 upsides that it has over Demonic Tutor, but it comes with 2 pretty real downsides. First, you have to pay 2 life. Second, you put the card on top of your library instead of directly into your hand. Going down a card to tutor something up is definitely downside, but ultimately Vampiric Tutor still ended up being too good for all the same reasons that Demonic Tutor was considered too good. It ultimately got banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, and that remains true today. At number 3, I've got Brainstorm, which is supposed to be a fixed Ancestral Recall. Recall is, of course, one of the Power 9, and easily the best draw spell in the entire game. For 1 blue, it's an instant that lets target player draw 3 cards. Like the other Power 9 and Demonic Tutor, it got the axe in Magic's very first banned and restricted announcement, and it has never in its history been legal as more of a one-of in any 60-card format. A couple of years later, in 1995, Wizards of the Coast designed a fixed Ancestral Recall in Brainstorm. It's an instant that draws you 3 cards for a single blue mana. Unlike Ancestral Recall, it makes you put 2 cards back on top of your library. In other words, you really only break even on cards and get some card selection. While that's definitely weaker than Ancestral Recall, it ended up not being quite as powered down as they had hoped. It still digs you really deep into your deck for a very low cost, and it's often combined with shuffle effects, like fetch lands, which lets you shuffle away cards you really don't want. Brainstorm has gone on to be arguably the second best draw spell in the entire game, and is a format-defining card in Legacy, while it's restricted in Vintage. At number 2, we continue our theme of Power Down, Power 9 cards. I've got MOX Diamond and Chrome Mox here, both of which are fixed versions of the original Power 9 Moxen, all of which are 0 mana artifacts that can tap for mana of a color. That's some serious fast mana that can get you off to an incredible start. Again, these cards were obviously busted and have been legal only as a one-of in Vintage for their entire history. MOX Diamond and Chrome Mox were both attempts at weakened versions of these powerful mana rocks. MOX Diamond from 1997's Weatherlight and Chrome Mox from 2003's Mirrodin have very similar designs, meant to emulate the original Moxen while coming with significant downside. They both cost 0 mana and can tap for mana, but they both force you to give up a card in your hand or they don't do anything. MOX Diamond produces mana of any color, but it makes you discard a land from your hand or sacrifice it, and Chrome Mox makes you exile a card from your hand, and then it can tap for mana of any of the exiled card's colors. Turns out, even when you make fast mana 2 for 1 its controller, it's still pretty insane. Just like the original Moxen, MOX Diamond had to be restricted in Vintage and banned everywhere else. In its past, Chrome Mox has been banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage too, and it remains banned in Modern today. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone at this point, I've got a couple of fixed black Lotuses. Black Lotus is arguably the strongest card in the game. It's a 0 mana artifact that you can sacrifice to add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool. This is another card that has never been legal as more than a 1-of in any competitive format, and it's a card you can only play in Vintage today. Black Lotus allows for completely insane starts. Because of its power and its rarity, the Lotus is probably the most iconic card in the game. So it's no surprise that they've designed many fixed Black Lotuses over the years. In fact, I did an MTG top 10 on Lotuses last week, and that was what made me interested in making this particular top 10. Anyway, Lion's Eye Diamond was the first attempt at a powered down Lotus, and it was printed in 1996's Mirage. It costs 0 and has the same effect as the original Lotus, except you have to discard your hand. This seems like it would be enough to power down the Diamond, and it certainly does make it more narrow, but there are plenty of situations where the downside is irrelevant, and some decks can even turn it into upside. The card first showed how busted it was alongside another card that showed up on this list, Yogmoths Will, which lets you cast your whole graveyard. If you cast Will, Lion's Eye Diamond will end up giving you 6 mana in the turn, which is often more than enough to cast everything you discard anyway. Many other graveyard decks have loved Lion's Eye Diamond over the years, and that's resulted in it getting restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy. It is legal these days in Legacy, and that's a format where it really thrives today. Lotus Petal was another attempt at a fixed Lotus. It's also 0 mana, and you can sack it for a single mana. That's right, it gives you 1/3 of the effect of Black Lotus. Surely, that's enough to keep it from being too good, right? Wrong. It's still allowed a free mana boost, and for the most part, that's just too good in any of Magic's formats. Like Black Lotus, the Petal ended up being banned everywhere but Vintage, where it was restricted. It has since been unbanned in Legacy, though. So, those are my picks for the 10 most notable times when they tried to design a fixed version of a busted card, but the end result was still incredibly powerful. Do you think there are any I left out? Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to own any of these cards, in their original or fixed versions, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it to increase its reach. If you want to catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.